Hello, my name is Karen Lee, and I'm going to be talking about the autobiographical novel, personal essay, and memoir, Are You Confused Yet? My background is a professional one. I'm a retired clinical psychologist and management consultant. I've taught every grade from junior kindergarten to senior executives and traveled around the world to do my consulting. My very first venture into writing a book was nonfiction. It's about consulting. So I think I knew from the start that writing nonfiction was really my genre. I went on from that to write many articles for academic magazines, academic journals, trade magazines, and so on. And then in 2016, my own memoir, The Full Catastrophe, was published by She Writes Press in California. So when you're contemplating writing a memoir, there are some basic things you need to know. And I would like this to be a discussion. So if you have a question or comment, please don't hesitate to interrupt us, and we'll make sure that you get your comment or question addressed. So the first thing to know, hi Sue. The first thing to know is what a memoir is and is not. And anybody who's attended any of my classes will know that I really emphasize this a lot. An autobiography is often misunderstood as a memoir, but it's not. It's actually a chronicle of one's life. It describes the events of one's life for the edification of family or fans of famous people. So people like Bob Dylan recently wrote an autobiography. A memoir, however, is a story out of one's life. And it illustrates a universal truth. It's a narrative, so it uses a story arc, has a protagonist, which is you, the writer. You have scenes, dialogue, and in the end, there's a lesson learned. There's growth on the part of the author, and there's a point to the struggle that the author has gone through. So you can actually write several memoirs. An example of this is Alexandra Fuller, Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight. She followed that up with another memoir, Cocktail Hour Under the Tree of Forgetfulness. And this is not the only example of memoirists who have written several memoirs. So researching for a memoir. You'd think that because it's a memoir and it's your story and it's your memories, you wouldn't need to do research, but that's actually not true. So you do have to write about the memories from the time of your life that you're writing about, but you also need to go through your old journals, if you're lucky enough to have written them, old yearbooks, day timers, photos, calendars, and use the information that you glean as a jumping off point for writing about those memories. For context, you can look at local newspapers, and I was lucky enough, I'm writing right now a memoir of the little tiny village in Ontario that I grew up in, and lo and behold, the local small town newspaper is all online from 1935 to the present day. And you can actually, it's so well done, you can actually read all the articles. So lots of times you can find those local newspapers online. And even if you're not writing about something that's directly addressed in the newspaper, it's a good idea just to have a look at it so you have a flavor for the time that you're writing about. You can also go through genealogy reports, church and school records, laws, general beliefs of the time to get that context, which is so important. You can look for popular pastimes and food and penny candy, that type of thing. You might interview those who are present at the time you're writing about, and I've done that. You can contact them via Facebook. Well, for all those people who malign Facebook, it sure is handy for finding old classmates and people who lived in the area that you lived in at the time you're writing about. And you can actually look for village or town Facebook sites. And I did that, and I posted requests on those town Facebook sites for anybody who knew the village and who went to the school that I went to. I've ended up interviewing nearly 30 people. So as I say, at the moment, I'm writing a memoir of the village I grew up in the 50s and 60s and what happened there. So I'm doing online research, the interviews, all to get other people's versions of the story. And of course, also writing my own part of the story. Now, memoirs are written in creative nonfiction, which means that you write a combination of what you remember and what you recreate from what you know happened. Because creative nonfiction uses techniques from fiction, you can look into books on fiction. For example, The Emotional Craft of Fiction by Donald Mass. So you can even look at books on writing that are not specific to writing memoir to get lots of good hints for good writing techniques. And you want different articles and books that teach you about point of view and other creative nonfiction techniques to help you with that writing. Marion Roach Smith, I highly recommend. She writes an excellent blog on memoir, and you can sign up for that blog, and she has a lot of different interesting writers besides herself. And sometimes she does online webinars as well. So Marion Roach Smith says that a memoir is about X, which is a universal truth, as illustrated by Y, which is your story. So it's not specifically about your story, it's about what your story illustrates about a universal truth that anybody could relate to. And you do that, of course, in a book or essay format, and we'll get into that in a minute. After you start writing, you may have lots of questions, and this part is very important to do before you write too far. What is the theme or universal truth or lesson you want to convey? Could you please post your name? Is that me you're talking about?
Oh, sure. It's not
okay.
coming up. It should be coming up. I'll put it up.
Yeah. So my name is Karen E. Elizabeth Lee, L-E-E, for those who didn't catch that. Slow down. Okay, sorry. Please, if there's something you missed that I just kind of maybe rushed through a little bit, just stop me and let me know. So when you know the theme or the universal truth that you're wanting to convey, it makes it a lot easier to pick out the events from your life that are going to best illustrate that. So for some people, it might be a health issue and what they went through to conquer that health issue. For other people, it might be abandonment issues. Maybe you were adopted as a child and you want to write about that issue. Maybe in your family, there were alcohol and drug issues. Maybe you went through a divorce yourself, or maybe you were the child of a family that divorced. Maybe you've had to look at death issues. So when you know the theme that you're writing about, then it will be easier to pick out the things in your life that best illustrate that. So some modern classic memoirs, if you will, are some that you're going to be very familiar with. The Glass Castle, Educated, A Mind Spread Out on the Ground, more recent one. An older one, Angela's Ashes. I highly recommend reading Angela's Ashes if you haven't, because of the very, very strong voice. Boy, as soon as you pick it up, you can hear his voice coming through the pages. And that's what you want when you are reading a memoir. You want to be able to hear and connect with the writer. So there's some terminology, and sometimes people say, oh, well, I don't really have to know that. But I'll get to that part later as to why it's really important to know the genre that you're writing in and what terms best describe that. So there used to be a very firm line between fiction and nonfiction, and memoirs stood firmly in the nonfiction section. But now that line has been blurred somewhat. So in the past, the only question was, is the narrative real or is it made up? For example, it's long been accepted that poetry, there's a comment here. I'm not getting the comments, so maybe I'll just have to, oh, here we go. Ah, interesting. Yes, somebody's saying there's an issue with educated. There seems little evidence of lessons learned. What is your view of this? Well, interestingly, there are some people who feel that you should only tell the story and let the reader come up with the lessons out of that story. Because I would say The Glass Castle is another example of one memoir that doesn't go in very much to what was learned, but Educated, I would say, is probably a better example where you're not kind of hit in the face with this is what I got out of this experience, except to say that the struggle for education in that particular family was true for many of the children. And in fact, in Educated, which I do recommend, several of the children now from a family that didn't even want them to go to any formal education now have PhDs. So obviously there was a great yearning for education and to get out of the small isolated mountain family town that these children were raised in. I'll go into that a little bit further too in a minute about some people being real purists about memoir and what it should contain and what it shouldn't contain, if you will. So I was talking very briefly about poetry. Poetry falls somewhere between true life and fantasy. It's neither fiction nor nonfiction, but a flickering between the two. And that's a quote from Ben Lerner. And in the book, From the Ashes, Jesse Thistle combines poetry and memoir to chronicle his intimate journey of overcoming addiction and homelessness to becoming a decorated Indigenous academic. And he told that story, his story, in short chapters interspersed with poetry. Now, I'm finding this very interesting, all the different ways that we can now use creatively to be able to tell those stories. So today, longer narratives, short stories, or book-length work can wander between nonfiction and fiction. Even reviewers call personal essays memoirs and memoirs autobiographies. There are many new terms popping up that are specific to one kind of writing, one kind of story. For example, is a novel always fiction? I always thought it was, but now after doing so much research, I realized that I'm not keeping up with the times. Can you mix genres? What makes the different structures different from each other? So let's take a look quickly at personal essay. A personal essay is a narrative in which the author writes about a personal incident or about some topic or issue of great importance to that author. So in which the writer has gained significant meaning, insight, or learned a lesson. It uses fictional techniques, just like memoir, to include dialogue, imagery, characterization, conflict, and setting. In other words, all those elements of creative nonfiction. It's always written in first person, like a memoir, and the writer's describing an incident that resulted in personal growth or development. So there's a lesson or meaning to the story. In the recent Maclean's magazine, August 2020, there's an article called A Whole New Kind of Grief by Calgary author Kristin Frangu. Now, she personally went through the death of a loved one. And so what she's written is the effect of COVID on families and individuals experiencing death, whether that's through COVID or having the death of a family member or loved one by some other means. So it is. And the personal essay, as illustrated by Christina's article, is a glimpse not only into the people that she's interviewing, but into her own personal feelings as well. And it might be the means of discovering the meaning behind that topic or incident in one's life. In other words, the writing of the personal essay can lead to insights on the part of the writer. Now, I experienced that when I wrote my own memoir, because I wrote my memoir to answer a question, which was, how did an intelligent, well-educated woman end up with not one, but two abusive husbands? Because when I started that book, to write that book, I didn't know the answer to that question. By the time I finished the whole manuscript, I knew. And so that's the wonderful thing about writing memoirs or personal essays. You can discover things you never thought you knew. So, and the personal essay doesn't have to be objective. It's one's own judgment and personal opinion. And the writer must express his or her feelings, thoughts, and emotions. It can be a combination of storytelling, facts, and wisdom, examining a subject outside oneself, but through the lens of the self. So the personal essay can wander through a topic, and I have an excellent example of that. 4 Seasons in Rome by Anthony Doerr is a lengthy, book-length personal essay. It circles around a subject. You get the long and the short view of the subject. It provides you, his descriptions provide you with experience, knowledge, research, and personal history and opinions, turning points in one's life, adversity, and they all provide you with personal meaning. So there are different kinds of personal essay. And here, the personal essay is one of the things where there's quite a bit of controversy about. So the different types are basically the short story and the exploration of a topic of interest to the writer. Hood in 2013 said the writer uses self-disclosure, honesty, and truth, but it must have a universal theme or main point. The personal essay can be any length. As I've shown you, it's book length, like Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own or Anthony Doerr's 4 Seasons in Rome. Keith Conn Harris's book, Denial, The Unspeakable Truth. You can see how I've gone through this, underlined, and put sticky notes everywhere. This is a book-length personal essay. He explores the issue of denial from several different angles, which is characteristic of a personal essay. As in memoir, the writer must be self-aware, and self-aware enough to strip off their own public persona and expose themselves, expose their opinions and thoughts. And in doing so, learns more about self-awareness. The author goes from ignorance to self-knowledge. Philip Lopate, who has written tons of articles, books, etc., so this is one, To Show and Tell. He writes a lot about personal essay. And he states that how the author sees others and moves through the world and experiences pain, disappointment, joy, these are classic topics for a personal essay. It's not a formal argument of a theme that you might find more in a thesis or dissertation. It's more a conversation in which the author reveals his or her own views. Alexander Chee's book, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, is a memoir written in a series of personal essays. They tell the stories of different incidents and aspects of his life from adolescence to successful writer. It's a very, very engaging book. And his link between the essays is his universal truth, which is about finding identity. So it's not a continuous narrative. It's coming at the topic of identity from various angles, and then the reader puts it together. So a well-written memoir, like a novel, has a recognizable story arc, whereas the personal essay can be a wandering, intuitive exploration of a topic, coming at that topic from many angles. When I have to confess, when I first read Anthony Doerr's book about Rome, I thought, whoa, this is a terrible memoir, because people called it a memoir. So I was looking for that through story. I was looking for the story arc, and it isn't there. So as soon as I realized it was a personal essay, then I had a much greater appreciation for that particular book. Because it does include character descriptions and setting and dialogue and conflict to explain his exploration of the city of Rome. And in memoir, it is both better and possible to write a balanced story. So in personal essay, you can certainly write your point of view. But in a memoir, you want to have a more balanced picture. You don't want to paint the people in your life as all black or all white, all good, all bad, because people aren't like that. People are shades of gray. People are, and that's no reference to that book. People have good points and not so good points. And if you write a memoir indicating that one person in the story is very evil, for example, without kind of tempering it a bit, it's not going to come across as realistic. So you want to have a balanced view on what has happened in your life in your memoir. Now, interestingly, there's more controversy about the personal essay than many other forms of writing that I've found. Nikki Porter, for example, in an article states definitively that a personal essay is a short story, plain and simple, no argument. And Joyce Maynard also sticks to that personal essay as short memoir form in her video series, How to Write a Personal Essay. Now, I do actually recommend the video series, How to Write a Personal Essay, but it is how to write a short form memoir, not broadband personal essay. And her video series concentrates on writing about the small, significant personal incidents in one's life. So her personal essays are short stories taken from life, in other words, short memoirs. She states that for her, a personal essay is not a poetic reverie or meditation that Philip Lopate talks about. She finds this boring, so she immediately dismisses that genre out of hand. That's not worth anybody's time, according to her, because she doesn't like it. And I respect Joyce Maynard as a writer, but not in that particular opinion. So Joyce Maynard's not a fan of the type personal essay that Philip Lopate describes. However, just because she doesn't like that form doesn't mean that she's correct. Creative nonfiction is a technique that, again, if you've taken any of my classes or if you've done any memoir work at all, you'll be familiar with that term, creative nonfiction. So it's a technique that uses the same devices as novels to tell a story, only the story is true. So it combines showing and telling. It has character descriptions, dialogue, scenes, settings, and a story arc that all help to tell the true story in as realistic a way and relatable a way as possible. It is a standard way of writing a memoir now and has been employed in some of those memoirs I mentioned, The Glass Castle, Educated, Angela's Ashes, The Liar's Club, and my own memoir, The Full Catastrophe, so that you're following the person's story through the build-up, what happened before the key incidents in their life. You come to a part of the story where it's a crisis point, and then the resolution. So classic story arc. The creative part is that in our stories, especially true stories, you know something happened, you know an event, a conversation, and we know the effect that that had, but we can't remember the details, especially if it happened 30 years ago. So we recreate. We're not creating, we're recreating to the best of our ability. And particularly important is to give the same emotions and tone of the original event. We don't invent anything, we recreate a known thing. And such a book or story sticks very closely to actual events. Now, some memoirists, kind of purists like Marion Roach Smith, doesn't even think you should change names or place names in your story. Most people in memoirs do change names and place names to
avoid litigation.
No, it actually won't. If you write somebody's story, if you write somebody in your story and it's really clear who they are, the only things you really have to worry about are, did you tell the truth? And will that person be able to make a living after you publish your book? Very, very few people ever get sued. It's something people worry about a lot, but it hardly ever happens. So, I think as long as you write the truth and write a balanced story, then you're probably safe to go.
Although they might stop talking to you if they're family or friends.
Well, that is the issue. The issue is that some people may not like being written about, no matter what it is, even if it's positive. And interestingly, when I wrote my memoir, somebody that I know, but who doesn't play a real role in the story, was upset because I didn't put him in.
Yeah, the reverse. They wanted to be famous.
They wanted to be in the story, and they just honestly weren't part of the main story, so there was no point.
Yeah.
And there's another technique that's often used in most memoirs, which is the author saying, back then I did this, or back then I thought this, but now I realize blah, blah, blah.
Hindsight.
And some memoirs think if you're putting that in, then you're just writing a chronicle. You're not writing a true memoir. And their rule is that you just simply tell the story as it happened back then. And a pretty good example of that is The Glass Castle, because she doesn't do a lot of, now I know this, but I didn't know it then. Now, I personally don't have a problem with that, because I think you do have to anchor the reader in the fact that the events you're talking about happened before now. And now you do have some thoughts and ideas about what happened then, because then that builds up to the overall learnings, which at the end of the book or story, you hope the reader comes away with that, oh yes, the person learned this. So anyway, that again, that just disagreements on what, there isn't a right or wrong. certainly on that particular aspect.
Sounds like character development is key.
From Sue McClarty to all panelists, boring. If I'm boring somebody, please point out that you want to hear something different.
Do you have a question?
Oh, okay, not you. Okay.
Okay.
All right, great. Thank you. So an autobiographical novel is the same as a work of creative nonfiction. Now, this is where I got trapped because I thought the word novel meant fiction, but it doesn't. If it's prefaced with the word autobiographical novel, it simply means memoir written in the genre of creative nonfiction. So we can add these labels, and that's what I meant about the whole literary field is changing so much, and I think that's really good because I think now people can combine fantasy with reality, as long as you're letting the reader know, or if you are really clever, you can kind of slip from one to the other. Again, if you're writing strictly a memoir, then you're not going to want to slip into fiction unless that plays an important part in your memoir. If you were a child who slipped into fiction in order to cope with something happening when you were a child, then you want to give a flavor of that for sure. Now, Sue is saying something about no emotion in memoir. I think we should have lots of emotion in memoir. You want people to feel what you felt at the time. So that's a really important thing. You want to take that reader back to those incidents in your past that you're writing about and kind of feel for themselves what they might have felt in that situation. So the autobiographical novel follows the same kind of pattern or rule as creative nonfiction. You can't alter things too much. You can leave out unimportant details. You don't want to write about every single minute thing that happened every single day. That really is boring. You take out the unimportant details and events, and you can change names of places, but you can't change major events. You can't make up things to make your story more interesting. Now, the term autobiographical fiction, as soon as you get that word fiction, you know it's made up. So that's used to describe a narrative that's highly influenced by or loosely based on or inspired by the actual thoughts, feelings, and experiences of the author. But the story might be changed. Because you've said it's autobiographical fiction, you've set it up to be accepted as fictional, but influenced or inspired by real events, which is not acceptable in memoir. You can't throw things in. So Romana Clay is another form, if you will. It's a novel about real life events that's overlain with a facade of fiction. The fictitious names in the novel actually represent real people, and the events in a Romana Clay actually happened. So it actually can be a memoir, but it's presented to the world as though it's fiction. And there's a number of reasons why an author might do this. First of all, it could be done to enhance one's standing as a novelist. Because in the past, memoir was not as highly regarded or as popular as it is today. So somebody might have written something that was real in the past, but they wanted to make it sound as though they were an accomplished novelist, and they were able to write this novel. Or the author is embarrassed by real life events and doesn't want to admit that this really happened. Now, somebody gave me a book very recently, a new book that's come out called My Dark Vanessa. I don't know if anybody's run across this. It has been released as a fictional novel, but there were several clues that it is actually a memoir. Clue number one, the events in the book start when the girl is 15. The author says she started writing this book when she was 16 and took, I think, 20 years to write it. And what is really interesting is that in the front of her book, where often you will find things like names and identifying characteristics have been changed to protect the privacy of certain individuals. Well, she actually had a whole page disclaimer saying, "This is not me. Don't think it's me. I fear thou dost protest too much." Now, so it's interesting. I mean, I don't know why she did it that way, because, as I say, memoirs are really popular right now. And if it's a well-written memoir, why not put it out as a memoir? But she didn't. Now, if the work that you're writing is highly influenced by the actions of real individuals, then you need to be careful that they're not identifiable. I did kind of touch on that before. The only thing I've ever heard of where that was a factor was in England, and a woman wrote about a real incident that happened between her and a member of the royal family. She was given a huge upfront royalty, and then the book was pulled from publication because the royal family lawyers did not want it published. So in most cases, as I say, you don't get sued, and you might bother your sister or your uncle or somebody, but in most cases, you know, you're not going to get into trouble.
You're not royalty.
No, I'm not royalty. So then we come to the personal aspect of this. What's your goal in writing a book or a story? You have to make the decision whether your story might be more effective if written as a memoir rather than presented to the world as a fictional novel. What will impact the reader more? Knowing somebody has actually gone through an experience, or reading something that is presented as fiction? What's going to get your story across to the reader the best? And again, what do you want to write? I mean, I started this off by saying that, I can't find the book now, but I've never had any fiction published. Don't tell anybody. But I've had lots of nonfiction published. So that's clearly my genre, and that's fine. Other people love writing fiction, and that's fine too. So if you like to write fiction, then write that. And don't worry about whether somebody else says, "Why don't you write your memoir? You've got such an interesting story." Well, you might have, but that may not be the thing you want to write. What about a novel inspired by your life? There's another genre. Or specific events in your life. Writer Pat Conroy is a really good example of someone who wrote both memoir and also used real life to inspire his novels. Another example is Lisa O'Donnell's book, Closed Doors, inspired by a memory from her childhood. Then there's the semi-autobiographical novel, like Prep by Curtis Sittenfeld, that was largely based on her own experiences. Chronicles are more like autobiographies or biographies, and I have a really good example of a chronicle. The narrative goes from event to event and is often more telling than showing. Diana Athill's book, Stet, now she has written at least 8 or 9 books. Sadly, she passed last year at age 101. And she is my inspiration for being able to write as long as you can hold a pencil or can tap your keyboard. What a wonderful life. She started off as an editor for a major publishing firm in London. And this book is partially about the publishing firm and partially about her role in the publishing firm. And then she writes about 4 major authors that she was the editor for. So I call that a chronicle. And the book does tell you something about her life, but it's not a memoir in the strictest sense. So decide what form your memoir will take. Once you get your understanding of the genre straight, how do you decide what's the right form for your writing? Is it about what you feel most comfortable with, which I've alluded to, or what suits the material you're writing about? If you're writing about domestic abuse, do you want to read about it in a fictional book, or do you want to read the actual experience of somebody who's gone through that? Again, you have to make that decision. So what's your goal? If it's to educate, you might be better writing a memoir. If it's to entertain, maybe write a fictional account of some event. If you have a preference for writing fiction or nonfiction, that will dictate the genre you'll write in. So there are pros and cons of each memoir form, though. The personal essay, you can write about an important small incident without worrying about whether it's a big enough incident to become a full-length book. And that can become very important, because if you want to write about a personal incident that's important, and then submit it to a magazine or an online literary site or as part of an anthology, well, the personal essay is absolutely perfect for you. So you have a choice between doing an opinion piece for a magazine, an exploration of a topic that you're interested in, or a short story. Or if, like Alexander Chee, you write enough personal essays, you can combine them and publish them as a full-length book. Now, the only caution around doing that is that those tend not to be quite as popular as the full-length memoir, that ones we've talked about. If you have a longer story to tell, either theme-based or event-based story, in which you learned a lot and you matured and you grew in understanding over a period of time, and you're willing to be open and balanced in the telling, now that is absolutely crucial, then memoir is a really good choice for you. Do you want to help others deal with an issue similar to your own? Then again, the real life story often has a huge impact. So will your story have more impact as a memoir or presented as fiction? Again, nobody can kind of pre-tell those things. You want to make that decision for yourself. If you like the idea of writing fiction and you have a story to tell, then maybe you want to do a story inspired by real life and make that clear on the front of your book that that's what it is. And then it could be largely fictional and only inspired by that real incident. Most novels are inspired by some real incidents anyway. So you can make this clear that this is inspired by your life, but isn't necessarily all 100% accurate. Now, historical fiction, I just finished a book last night, The Book of Lost Names. Now, this writer has written about incidents during the Second World War many times, and this is the first book I've read by her, but it is based on real events that happened, but the characters in her story are fictional. So just about everybody is familiar with historical fiction. So that's a really good example of a real life incident providing the setting and backdrop for fiction. And again, there's lots of examples of historical fiction. It's a very popular genre. When are all these labels, okay, I'm almost done. When are all these labels really important? Because you might be saying, what does it matter? Well, when you're pitching your work to an agent, it is important. It's important to be able to say, this is based on my life, but it's a fictional book. Or this is a memoir, true to what happened, or this is historical fiction where the background is true, but the characters are fictional. And also, when you're finally finished that book and you are asked to speak, but the background is true, the history is true. So, does anybody have any questions? I know we don't have very much time, and I've delved into a lot of information.
I think we're at the wrap-up point. I just want to remind everybody that this is recorded, so you can catch us if you want to review this or listen to this wonderful panel. Karen, I want to thank you. This has been amazing. The amount of information has been so insightful. I had no idea that there was so many differences within the genre. And now you have a book out?
Yes, I do. Yeah, The Full Catastrophe, a memoir. It is listed in the When Words Collide book list.
Yes.
And I'm also writing a new book, which has not come out yet and probably won't for a little while. Also a memoir. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
And somebody mentioned, sorry, go ahead.
You have a website?
I have a website, Karen E. Lee Author, and I also have a Facebook site. Please go on my Facebook site, Karen E. Lee Author, and if you have questions or comments or want to get in touch with me, I am more than happy to do that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for presenting for us today, and thank you everyone for attending. And stay home, stay safe, and don't forget to follow up next week on When Words Collide if you want to, catch a review of any of the panels that have been taking place. So many wonderful panels. And Karen, I can't wait to check out your Facebook, so I'll be reaching out to you.
Okay, great. Looking forward to it. And thank you for everyone who was watching, listening, and for the people who made comments.
Thanks. Keep safe, everyone. Thanks.